The air outside the old stone church in downtown Seattle was crisp with the cool edge of late October maple leaves, skittering across the steps in quick spirals before catching against the carved wooden doors. Inside, the light was golden and soft, filtering through stained glass to paint the aisle in shades of ruby and amber. In the small anteroom beside the sanctuary, Hannah Grace stood in front of a full-length mirror, the satin of her wedding gown gleaming under the warm bulbs above. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the skirt, her breath unsteady, despite the tight corset that already restricted every inhale. She had imagined this day since she was a girl, but never quite like this. She had pictured her father's arms steady at her side, the pews filled with smiling faces, the low hum of whispered excitement as the organist played. She had imagined Daniel waiting at the altar, tall and composed eyes, soft with the certainty of love. Her reflection now showed a different truth. Mascara already smudged at the corners of her eyes, lipstick slightly faded where she had bitten her lip, and a tension in her jaw that told the story of a woman holding herself together with fragile thread. The phone on the vanity buzzed once, then again. She hesitated, glancing at the door where her maid of honor had gone to check on last-minute details. Finally, she picked it up. The text was only a single sentence, each word as sharp as a blade. "I cannot do this. I am sorry. I cannot marry someone like you." Her eyes moved over the message once, then again, as if repetition could change it. Her fingers went cold. The hum of voices in the sanctuary seemed to fade, replaced by the thud of her heartbeat in her ears. The silk bodice felt suddenly too tight. The world didn't tilt or spin. It simply stopped. She set the phone down with deliberate care, her breath coming in shallow sips. Somewhere down the hall, the organist began the opening chords. Someone knocked gently on the door. Hannah could not move. The words repeated in her mind with merciless clarity. "Not marry someone like you." The meaning was not hidden. It had never been hidden. She had known the way Daniel's mother looked at her when she thought no one was watching. She had heard the careful jokes from his friends. She had felt the subtle but constant pressure to become less of herself in every possible way. Less outspoken, less visible, less in size. The knock came again, more insistent this time. She reached for the door, then stopped. Instead, she turned back to the mirror, searching for some trace of the joy she had expected to see today. The woman staring back at her was still Hannah Grace, full-bodied, full-hearted, with eyes the color of fresh coffee and a smile that had been called too wide for her face. She saw the curve of her arms, the strength in her shoulders, the softness in her jaw. She saw a woman abandoned without warning, yet still standing. The voices outside grew louder. Someone called her name. She gathered the skirt in both hands and crossed the room to the side exit. The door opened to a narrow alley, lined with brick walls damp from last night's rain. Cool air rushed over her skin, carrying the faint scent of roasted coffee from the cafe down the street. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward the main road each step, away from the church, an unplanned act of survival. She did not notice the man at first. He was leaning against a black sedan parked a few feet from the curb, a phone in one hand, the other resting loosely in his pocket. His suit was dark and impeccably cut, his tie the deep blue of a midnight sky. When she passed, something slipped from her wrist. The small silver heart-shaped pendant that had belonged to her mother landed on the sidewalk with a muted chime. He bent to pick it up, turning it once in his palm before stepping toward her. "You dropped this," he said, his voice calm and low. She took it from him, murmuring thanks without meeting his gaze. There was no judgment in his tone, no curiosity about the sight of a woman in a wedding gown, walking alone through the city streets. Only the steady presence of someone who, for reasons unknown, was simply there. She walked on fingers, closing around the pendant, the cool metal warming slowly against her skin. The image of his eyes followed her not for their color or shape, but for the absence of the thing she feared most in moments like this pity. It was the kind of moment that stopped the world until a stranger's gaze began to write another story. Hannah Grace had not planned what to do next. The church was behind her, the life she thought she was stepping into, gone in a single sentence. She walked without direction through the streets of downtown Seattle, the white satin of her gown catching on uneven pavement, drawing stares from strangers who whispered to each other or lifted their phones for a quick photo. By the time she reached the quiet waterfront, the clouds had thickened over Elliott Bay, and a fine mist settled on her hair and shoulders. She stopped at a bench facing the water, lowered herself onto the cold wood, and tried to breathe through the weight pressing against her chest. For 32 years, she had learned to live with people's opinions about her body, about what she should wear, eat, do, even who she should love. She had thought Daniel was different, that his proposal was proof that love could see past numbers on a scale. She had been wrong. She traced the outline of the silver pendant in her palm, remembering how her mother had clasped it around her neck when she turned 18. Her mother had been her fiercest protector, the one person who never asked her to shrink, who reminded her that beauty was not a narrow doorway only a few could fit through. Losing her 2 years ago to cancer had left a hollow ache that no friendship or romance had filled. A voice interrupted her thoughts, deep and steady. "You left this behind once today. It would be a shame if you lost it again." She turned to see the man from the church steps. He stood a few feet away, an umbrella in one hand, the other gesturing toward the pendant she already held. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. She managed a polite nod. "I will be fine." His expression did not change, though his eyes seemed to measure the truth of her words. "If fine means sitting in the cold in a wedding dress without a coat, then maybe you are," he said quietly. She almost smiled despite herself. "I guess fine is relative." He extended the umbrella. "At least take this." She hesitated, then accepted it, feeling the weight of the black canopy settle into her grasp. He inclined his head once, then stepped away, leaving her to the mist and the steady lap of the water against the pier. A week passed. Hannah returned to her small apartment in Capitol Hill, traded the gown for jeans and a sweater, and tried to resume her freelance work, designing interiors for small offices and apartments. She ignored the texts from well-meaning friends, asking if she wanted to talk, deleted the few photos that had surfaced online with captions like "runaway bride" or "groom gets cold feet," and told herself the world would forget soon enough. On Tuesday morning, her inbox held an unfamiliar name: Ethan Whitmore. The subject line was straightforward design proposal. The message was short: "Ms. Grace, I believe we met last week outside St. James Cathedral. I am in need of an interior designer for a new property and came across your card. Would you be available to discuss?" Attached was a photo of a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Skyline its open spaces empty, except for the faint outlines of construction dust on hardwood floors. She remembered slipping her card into the pocket of her clutch that morning, intending to leave it with the caterer's event manager as a networking gesture. Somehow it had found its way into this man's hands. She considered ignoring the email wary of pity, disguised as opportunity, but her bank account argued otherwise. The next afternoon, she met him in the lobby of the high-rise, where the penthouse occupied the top floor. In daylight, he looked much the same as she remembered. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, with the reserved bearing of someone accustomed to silence. He offered his hand. "Hannah Grace." "Thank you for coming." "Ethan Whitmore," she replied. They rode the private elevator together, the soft hum of machinery, the only sound until the doors opened to reveal the vast expanse of glass and steel. "I want it to feel like home," he said simply. "Warm, functional nothing that screams I live in a magazine." She walked the rooms with her tablet, noting the light, the angles, the possibilities. She spoke of natural textures, muted colors, spaces designed for comfort as much as style. He listened without interrupting his gaze, steady but never intrusive. When she asked about a timeline, he said, "There is no rush. I would rather it be done right than fast." Something in his tone suggested he was speaking about more than furniture and paint. As they finalized the preliminary contract, she wondered if this was what beginning again could look like, not with grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but with quiet agreements and the trust to let someone in one room at a time. The first weeks of the project moved slowly, not because Hannah procrastinated, but because Ethan seemed content to let her shape the space at her own pace. He approved every design board she presented, asked questions about fabrics and lighting, and occasionally suggested a personal touch, like a reading nook near the window that faced the Puget Sound. She began to notice that he always offered her coffee. When she arrived, brewed strong in a French press, served in thick ceramic mugs without saucers. On rainy afternoons, they would stand by the glass wall, watching the city blur into watercolor through the downpour, while discussing whether the kitchen island should be marble or butcher block. One Thursday evening, a storm knocked out the power in the building while she was measuring the guest room for custom shelving. The elevator was out and the stairwell lights flickered before settling into darkness. Trapped on the penthouse floor with no idea how long it would last, she found Ethan lighting candles in heavy glass holders. He set one on the coffee table and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, then joined him on the low sofa. The flickering light softened the sharp lines of his face, casting shadows that made the space feel almost intimate. "You do not strike me as someone easily startled," he observed. "I have been through worse," she said, surprising herself with the honesty in her tone. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose you have." She expected him to ask about the wedding, but he did not. Instead, he spoke about his own life, about the years spent building his company, the travel, the loss of his wife, to a sudden illness 3 years earlier. He spoke without bitterness, but there was a heaviness under the words, the kind that lingers when someone has learned to live with absence. She told him about her mother, about the quilt they had stitched together during her last winter, about the way she still caught herself reaching for the phone, to share something only to remember there was no one to answer. They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the distant rumble of thunder, two people who understood what it meant to have loved and lost without ever saying the words. The following week, she came by to review the delivery of furniture. As they arranged the new pieces, their hands brushed when both reached for the same cushion. It was a small thing, but the warmth of that brief contact lingered in her fingertips long after she pulled back. She found herself looking forward to their meetings to the way his eyes seemed to soften when she spoke about design or books or the tiny herb garden she kept on her balcony. One afternoon, while she was laying out fabric samples, she noticed a stack of novels on the side table. "You read historical fiction," she said with a hint of surprise. His lips curved slightly. "My wife loved them. I suppose the habit stayed with me." She hesitated before admitting, "I read romance when I need." The reminder that happy endings exist. His gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Then perhaps we should exchange recommendations." From then on, whenever she visited, there would be a book set aside for her, sometimes wrapped in plain paper with no title visible, until she opened it at home. In return, she would bring small things she had made or baked: a jar of lavender sugar, a loaf of rosemary bread, a hand-stitched coaster. He accepted each gift with quiet gratitude, never making it feel transactional. As winter settled fully over the city, they developed a rhythm that felt almost like friendship, though something warmer hummed beneath it. She began staying a little longer after work was done, lingering over coffee, discussing not only the apartment, but music, family traditions, the places they dreamed of visiting. He listened in a way that made her feel seen, not just heard, as though each word she spoke mattered. For the first time in years, she stopped thinking about what her body looked like when she sat on his sofa or leaned over the dining table to sketch. She simply existed in the space, and that was enough. It was in these small, unremarkable moments, measuring a wall, tasting a new blend of tea he had ordered from a local shop, debating the merits of different reading lamps, that something unspoken began to grow steady and sure, like the slow lengthening of days after the winter solstice. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the revelation came, subtle and almost unremarkable at first. Hannah had arrived with swatches for the master bedroom, muted blues and grays she thought might complement the light from the western windows. Ethan was in his office, a space she had not entered before, and when he called for her to join him, she stepped into a room lined with dark shelves, the air faintly scented with cedar and paper. On one wall hung a series of framed photographs, each capturing moments of travel and celebration: a vineyard in Italy, a ski lodge in Colorado, a quiet garden in Kyoto. Her eyes moved from image to image until they caught on one in particular. It was of a woman standing on a sunlit terrace, hair lifted by the breeze, a wine glass in her hand. She was full-figured, radiant, her smile wide and unguarded. There was a warmth in her posture that seemed to spill beyond the frame. Hannah felt a jolt of recognition, not because she knew the woman, but because there was something in her expression, a certain fearless openness, that reminded her uncomfortably of herself on her best days. Ethan followed her gaze. "Her name was Lillian," he said after a pause. "My wife." She had been gone for 3 years, taken by a sudden illness that gave them no time to prepare or say goodbye properly. He spoke without breaking eye contact, his tone measured, but there was a shadow there, the kind that does not fade entirely. "She was the bravest person I ever knew. She walked into every room as if she belonged there, never apologized for the space, she took up never let anyone decide her worth for her. Hannah felt the weight of the words settle between them. She thought of the pendant in her bag, the church steps, the text message that had ended a life she had been ready to begin. She wondered if Ethan saw in her a ghost of what he had lost, if that was why his gaze carried both steadiness and something like caution. He seemed to sense her thought, "You are not her Hannah, and I do not want you to be, but there are pieces of you that remind me of the best parts of her." That is not a comparison, it is an acknowledgement. She swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. It was easier to focus on the swatches in her hand, to comment on how the deep slate might look against the window trim. Yet as they spoke, she found her mind returning to that photograph, to the way Lillian's presence filled the frame. The detail that struck her most was not the setting or the dress or even the smile, but the quiet confidence in her stance, a confidence that said beauty was not a concession, granted by others, but a truth carried within. When she left that day, the image stayed with her. So did Ethan's words looping in her thoughts with a weight she could not quite name. She had spent most of her life shrinking herself in the hope of fitting into someone else's idea of acceptable. Perhaps it was time to consider what it would mean to stand simply and unapologetically as she was. The first sign of trouble came on a gray Saturday morning when Hannah's phone lit up with notifications faster than she could clear them. At first, she thought it was a glitch, until she saw her name trending on a local news feed. The headline was blunt and paired with a photograph taken months earlier outside the church Billionaire Ethan Whitmore spotted with runaway bride. Beneath it, the caption twisted the truth into something almost unrecognizable, painting her as a jilted woman clinging to a wealthy man for rescue. Social media picked it up within hours, complete with side-by-side images comparing her body to the impossibly thin women Ethan had once been photographed with at public events. Comments ranged from mocking to cruel strangers, dissecting her worth, with the casual brutality of people who had nothing at stake. By the time she reached Ethan's penthouse for their scheduled meeting, her hands were cold and her chest felt hollow. He was in the middle of a phone call, but ended it quickly when he saw her expression. "I take it you have seen the news," he said. "I have seen worse," she replied, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her. His jaw tightened. "I will have my legal team handle it. They will issue statements, remove the worst of it." She shook her head. "That will not change what people think." He looked at her for a long moment. "Do you care what they think?" She wanted to say no, to claim the moral high ground of indifference, but the truth was more complicated. She cared because every cruel word was a reminder of what Daniel had written, of the unspoken judgment she had carried all her life, and now to have Ethan pulled into that same ugliness felt unbearable. Later that week, during a press conference for one of his development projects, a reporter asked outright about her. There was a pause before Ethan answered. "She is working on a design project for me. That is all I have to say." Hannah saw the clip online that evening. The words were professional, guarded, the kind of statement meant to shut down speculation. But to her it felt like a confirmation of her worst fear that he did not want to be associated with her beyond the scope of their work. The thought burrowed in, deep-fed by years of conditioning, that told her love was something she had to earn by being less of herself. That night, she drafted an email ending their contract, citing other commitments, and thanking him for the opportunity. She left the keys to the penthouse in a small envelope at the concierge desk and walked out without looking back. In the days that followed, she tried to throw herself into other projects, but her apartment felt smaller than ever, the air heavy with the absence of those quiet hours spent discussing color palettes and book recommendations. She avoided the news but could not escape the occasional photo of Ethan at some event, his expression as unreadable as ever. Part of her wanted to believe he would reach out, that he would explain the distance or apologize for it. Another part whispered that she had been foolish to expect anything more than a working relationship dressed up in moments of kindness. Either way, she told herself it was better to end things before the story turned into something she could not recover from again. Yet at night, when the city outside her window blurred into a scatter of lights, she would think of the way his gaze had held hers when he spoke about Lillian, and wonder if she had misread everything or simply walked away too soon. Ethan noticed the absence before the envelope arrived. The next time he returned to the penthouse, the usual stack of design sketches was gone. From the dining table, the vase of fresh tulips she often brought to brighten the space had wilted in their water, and there was no scent of the lavender hand cream she used lingering in the air. He found the envelope on the console near the door, her handwriting neat and final. Reading the letter was like standing in the shadow of a closing door. She thanked him for trusting her with the project, wished him success, and ended with a line that was polite but empty of warmth. It felt like losing something twice. For hours he sat in the quiet, replaying the press conference in his mind, hearing the cool detachment in his own voice when asked about her. He had thought he was protecting her by keeping the details private, but in doing so he had reinforced every fear she had ever hinted at. He realized he had been a coward, avoiding public acknowledgement, not because he was ashamed of her, but because the vulnerability of claiming her in front of the world terrified him. The memory of her walking away from the church on that first day came back to him, the image of her spine straight, despite the devastation in her eyes. She deserved someone who would stand beside her without hesitation. 2 days later, his assistant reminded him of the gala for the grand opening of his latest Horizon event that would draw press investors and half the city's elite. It was the last place Hannah would expect to see him make a personal declaration, which was precisely why he decided it would be there. The night of the gala, the ballroom was a blaze of crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes, the low hum of conversation, swelling beneath the soft strains of a string quartet. Cameras flashed as Ethan made his way to the podium for the scheduled remarks. He spoke briefly about the building, its design, the vision for the neighborhood. Then he paused, scanning the crowd, until he spotted her near the back, likely drawn by a mutual acquaintance or simple curiosity. Her hair was pulled back, a simple navy dress, skimming her figure, and even from across the room, he could see the guarded expression she wore like armor. There is someone here tonight who has changed the way I see the world. He began, his voice carrying over the quieting crowd. Someone who reminded me that strength is not loud and beauty is not narrow. I will not pretend the past few weeks have been easy for her, especially with her name tossed around in ways that were unfair and unkind. But I will say this to her and to anyone listening. Hannah Grace is not a headline. She is not a curiosity or a footnote in my life. She is a woman of talent, integrity, and courage, and I am proud to know her." A ripple went through the room, the collective intake of breath, as journalists lifted their cameras. He stepped away from the podium and crossed the room to where she stood, the attention of the entire gala following him. When he reached her, he extended his hand. "I should have said this sooner, but I am saying it now. You matter to me, Hannah. Not as a designer, not as a client, as you." Her eyes searched his face for any trace of hesitation. Ghiottoine. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. The applause began softly, then grew until it filled the space. For once, she did not feel the need to shrink under the gaze of so many eyes. Instead, she stood beside him, feeling the steady weight of his presence at her side. In that moment, it did not matter that the cameras were recording, that headlines would spin their own versions by morning. What mattered was that she knew without question that he had chosen to stand with her where everyone could see. The morning after the gala, Hannah woke to a phone overflowing with messages, some from friends cheering her on, others from strangers who had seen the video and sent words of support. There were still cruel comments mixed in, but they seemed smaller now, buried beneath the weight of those who understood what it meant for someone to be publicly claimed with respect and pride. She spent the day answering only a few messages, choosing instead to sit quietly with a mug of coffee and let the events of the previous night settle in her mind. By late afternoon, a knock at her door drew her to the hallway. Ethan stood there in a gray sweater and dark jeans, holding a paper bag from her favorite bakery. "I thought you might not have had lunch," he said simply. She stepped aside to let him in. The conversation that followed was not a dramatic confession or a plea for forgiveness. It was two people sitting at her small kitchen table, eating sandwiches and talking about the paint color for the guest room, as if nothing had broken between them. Except something had changed. The air was lighter, the space between their words warmer. In the weeks that followed, Hannah returned to the penthouse to complete the design, but this time the work felt different. She no longer entered as a contractor bound by a contract. She came as someone building a shared space, piece by piece. They added a corner reading nook just as he had suggested, months earlier filling it with shelves for their growing exchange of books. In the living room, she placed a wide armchair upholstered in a deep green fabric that reminded her of forest walks with her mother. Near the balcony, they planted lavender in large pots, the scent drifting inside whenever the doors were open. Evenings often found them cooking together in the kitchen, him chopping vegetables while she stirred sauces, music playing low in the background. Sometimes they would eat at the counter, sometimes on the balcony, with the city spread out before them, the hum of traffic a distant murmur. On Saturdays, they explored flea markets for unique pieces. A vintage lamp, a hand-woven throw, a set of mismatched ceramic mugs that made them both smile. With each choice, the apartment became less a showpiece and more a home. The day they placed the final cushion on the sofa, Hannah looked around at the space they had created and felt a quiet sense of completion. Ethan stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, surveying the room with the same thoughtful gaze he had turned on her so many times before. "Thank you," she said softly, "not just for trusting me with this, but for trusting me." He met her eyes. "You made this place something worth coming home to. I think you did the same for me. When spring arrived, they planned a small ceremony by the lake outside the city. There were no flashing cameras, no crowd of strangers, only family and close friends. Hannah wore a simple, cream-lace dress she had chosen without worrying about how it might be judged. As she walked toward him under the canopy of budding trees, she saw nothing but the steadiness in his gaze. Their vows were brief, spoken with the ease of two people who already understood what it meant to stand together in both silence and storm. Afterward, they danced on the grass to the sound of a single acoustic guitar, the lake catching the light of the late afternoon sun. Later, sitting at a table decorated with wildflowers, Hannah caught his hand and held it. For the first time in years, she realized she no longer measured herself against the expectations of others. She measured her life in moments like this, moments where she was fully herself and fully loved. In the months that followed their wedding, life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and deeply familiar, as though they had been moving toward this quiet steadiness all along. The penthouse remained their home base, but it no longer felt like a tower apart from the city. Friends came, often filling the rooms with conversation and laughter. Hannah kept working as a designer, taking on projects that inspired her rather than ones she felt obligated to accept. Ethan continued his business ventures, but he no longer measured success solely in square footage or market value. Some evenings they would walk along the waterfront, hand in hand, stopping for coffee at the small cafe whose scent had drifted toward her in the alley that first day. Other times they stayed in reading side by side in the corner nook they had built together, the soft hum of the city. Outside a reminder of the life they had chosen, there were moments when the world outside tried to intrude, when headlines resurfaced or unkind words found their way into her awareness, but they no longer had the power they once did. She had learned that the truest defense against judgment was not retreat or silence, but living fully in a way that made the opinions of strangers irrelevant. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the balcony, Ethan rested his arm around her shoulders and said, "You know you have changed my life." She turned to him with a small smile. "No, you just reminded me who I already was." The words felt like the simplest truth. Love had not rescued her from herself. It had revealed a self she had almost forgotten, one that could stand tall in any room, in any body, without apology. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the lights of the city began to sparkle, she thought of the girl in the mirror on her wedding day, the one holding herself together by fragile thread. That girl had walked away into the unknown, not knowing she would find someone who would not only see her, but choose her every day without hesitation. Love does not measure your waistline, she realized. It measures the size of your heart. And when two hearts are brave enough to meet without pretense or condition, they create a home that no storm can dismantle.